But first, let's look at a great icon of South Australia. And when Captain Charles Sturt made his historic voyage down the Murray River in his whaleboat way back in January 1830, I doubt he had any idea how much the magnificent waterway he discovered would change in the decades to follow. Of course, the rich resources of the River Murray have been supporting Indigenous Australians for thousands of years, and Sturt's glowing report of what he found led in part to South Australia being settled just over 6 years later. Now, 190 years on, almost, we're still struggling with maintaining the Murray-Darling Basin in a manner that's acceptable to all the various stakeholders. And the problem is, perhaps, they're spread over 4 states. With accusations of farmers effectively stealing water to political point scoring over calls for judicial inquiry still on the headlines, I thought it might be useful to put the importance of the Murray-Darling into some context for us as South Australians. And we're joined by Sandy Pitcher from she's the boss of the Department of Environment, Water and Natural Resources. Hi, Sandy.
Hi, Helen. How are you?
Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Look, most of us would have at some stage, been on a houseboat or up to a shack or visited some friends or has a shack on the Murray River. But it's much more to the South Australian state economy than just a place for recreation, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I think when we think about the river, it kind of evokes lots of emotions for many of us in South Australia, and I think it's one of the best examples of something that's absolutely critical for the environment, for the economy of South Australia, and, like you say, for the people, the connection. So it's the ultimate example of something that's the triple bottom line, if you like.
And we've played a really big role in managing the river since it was discovered. As I say, Captain Sturt went down there in his whaleboat, believe it. Isn't that amazing? And then, of course, when he got to the mouth, he had to row back. Well, I'm sure he didn't do much rowing.
No, direct the people, yeah.
But, we've put in locks and so forth. We've actually helped manage our end of the system, haven't we?
Yeah, there's been a lot of human intervention, but in one sense, probably that human intervention has come because we have been taking a lot of water out of the river along the way. So certainly in times before white settlers, the river was running its natural course and I think was probably able to run much more as a natural system. With human intervention, there's need to be lots of human protection perhaps as well. And a bit of a realisation using the science and understanding that we're gathering that our effects can sometimes have consequences that we hadn't foreseen.
And that's part of the issue, isn't it? That became particularly evident in the Millennium Drought, where effectively it almost dried up. There were parts of the Murray River where you could walk across the river if you wanted to get your feet dirty in the mud, but that was almost unimaginable.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, river systems, and Australia certainly has had droughts over time. However, when you're actually throwing in a lot of human intervention, agriculture and irrigation that we've done, it's actually not the same as comparing it to times over the past centuries. There's a lot of differences there, and so that's what we need to be really mindful of and continue to learn and explore. There's so much about our river system that we learn about after all of these different events.
And that's why the overarching organisation was set up, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. And as I mentioned in the intro, part of our dilemma is we've got 4 states with a very big vested interest in this, haven't we? We've got Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and us. Unfortunately, we're at the bottom end, so we reap the benefits or the disbenefits of what goes on up the river. How difficult is that process because there's so many parties involved?
Look, I think you're right to say there's 4 states involved, and that's tough. And I think most South Australians feel that, we are united at being at the end of the river and perhaps have the high moral ground of seeing all of the effects, good and bad, because at the end of the river system, that's what happens. But there's a lot of interest. I wouldn't like to say that everyone in other states doesn't care about the environment of the river. Here too, I think that there's not everyone in each state feels the same, and obviously you've got people with different economic interests, but also I think all of Australia wants a healthy river system, and the Murray-Darling Basin Authority is, I suppose, a creation of lots of different governments trying to balance lots of competing interests, but with a view to having a overall sense of keeping the river healthy and functioning for the needs of Australians. And that's really the challenge that we've really focused on in my department, and certainly the community of South Australia.
And part of the dilemma too, from where I'm sort of sitting looking in, is we have two areas of concern for the entire basin. There's the economic role that it plays, the irrigation and water supply and so forth, versus, in some people's minds, the environment. And really, they're equally as important. But we don't tend to hear as much about the environment as far as the challenge is concerned.
No, that's right. And I think actually the two other guests here today will be able to talk a lot more about that. I think from where I sit, actually the environment is the thing that perhaps we look at the science and think, what can you get back and what can't you get back? And I personally really worry about some of the damage that can be done where perhaps over-irrigation's happened in other parts of the river system where you just actually won't be able to repair that. You can't wait for another day and another rainy day, perhaps. And so for me, the thing that I think is so important for the river system is understanding that those trade-offs are not just ones that we can put off to another time. We have to make hard decisions now. And I think for many South Australians, it feels that many of our irrigation community made really hard decisions back in the 60s and 70s and have been doing that. And I think sometimes when it gets into the political argy-bargy, the debate is about who's made the hard efforts and when did they make them. That's part of the challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And it's something that we all have to take responsibility for. Look, also with us today, we've got the presiding member of the South Australian Murray-Darling Basin Natural Resources Management Board. Big breath after that. Sally Starick. Sharon Starick. Thanks for coming in. Good to see you.
Great to be here.
From your point of view, what do you hear from the users and so forth, particularly in South Australia, about what's going on upstream?
So I can probably comment about people in my local community and across the region, which is the South Australian Murray-Darling Basin. The vast majority of people understand that we actually do need a healthy river to have healthy communities and to have a healthy regional economy, which obviously underpins the state economy as well. So it doesn't matter whether I'm talking to irrigators, whether I'm talking to farmers, local government members, whether it's people based in Mannum or up in the Riverland. Communities do understand that we do need the river to be healthy, whether it's about supplying water for irrigation and agriculture in South Australia, whether it's about people's drinking water, or whether we're also talking about water for the environment. So that's making sure that we do have a healthy river in the long term, but it's also about so people can enjoy. And it's amazing, one of the learnings from the drought, the Millennium Drought, was when people saw the river dying, it really impacted on people's mental well-being and their own health in their own families. So it is just so vitally important to us all.
Cast your mind back to that drought, Lake Alexandrina, Lake Albert. I mean, it was tearful. What was going on down there. Lake Albert, we had to have actually cut it off, didn't we? And the lake basically turned sour. Not only did it dry up, but the water that was left was turned sour. Lots of farmers down there, but the general community, it's part of our history, and that's what happened because a drought came along. We will have another drought. So that's why the plan is so important. The damage that's been done, as Sandy said, sometimes can't be undone, can it? Can you give us an example of that?
I guess I can't give a really good example. Well, I could give an example around, for instance, soil acidity.
Yes, that's... Yep.
So down around Murray Bridge, there's an area which we call the Lower Murray Irrigation Area. And prior to the drought, it was a very... a productive area. A lot of dairy farmers were based in that area. It was highly, highly productive. Not too many issues. There were some concerns in terms of salinity, but really that was kept under very good management at that time. When the drought came along, a lot of the dairy farmers physically couldn't access water.
Couldn't get to it.
Absolutely, because they don't use pumps to pump water over the bank. They actually use things like sluice gates and those sorts of things. So they actually physically couldn't access the water because the river levels had dropped so drastically. What it did end up meaning is, firstly, we had a lot of dairy farmers who actually left the industry, which is really sad when we have such a great industry in South Australia, and an industry that is very well suited to that particular area in South Australia as well. We also then found that we ended up with acid sulphate soils, which means that our soils, those lower Murray irrigation area soils, actually dried out to such a degree and were basically producing acid, which was making its way back, providing acidic water back into the river if it wasn't managed. So that was one example of where we reached a tipping point where we can't wind back the clock. We can now manage it and look at managing it well, but we can't reverse what's already happened. So we actually need to learn from that and make sure that we don't get into that position again.
Absolutely. But to counter that, one of the successful initiatives is the Chalder Station, which is a wonderful part of the river, up in the Riverland. That's been a wonderful success story, hasn't it, of actually rescuing that area?
It absolutely has, and I'm sure Sandy could actually talk a little bit more about that. But in terms of putting regulators, which is a great big device, which helps to hold back water in some of the wetlands and then allow them to dry out, has been fantastic for our managing our wetlands and managing them in a much better way than what we could have previously.
And Sandy, that's really significant, isn't it? Because, for example, the iconic red gum, the river red gum. Yeah. I mean, it's named after the river, for goodness sake. It wants to be flooded one year. It wants to dry out the next year. We need to have this process in place, but we need to have the resources to do it.
We do.
And Chalder's a good example.
And it is, and I agree with you that it's a great example of where we've been able to do something positive for the river, but I still feel that it came out of the crisis. And in that sense, I think that's probably the feeling that South Australians have about our river, is that a lot of the great stories we have to tell are because we've really seen just how serious and dire the situation was, and we've worked together as a community to get those outcomes. And so it is a great success, but it was a sign of just how serious things had deteriorated, I suppose,
absolutely.
around there.
Give us a call if you've got a story about the Murray River. I'm sure it's played a big role in your life. 8223 0000. We'll come back after the break and have a bit of a chat about what's happening down the lower lakes, and the fact that they're World Heritage listed is an absolute big tick for South Australia, but that means we've got a responsibility to look after them all. 10 minutes away from 2, and a reminder that the world is on sale now at Flight Centre. You can fly around the world, stopping in Hong Kong, London and LA from just $1,479 return. Yes, they'll even bring you back. Call Flight Centre now on 131 600. Now, we've got a lineup of special guests in the studio talking about a great asset of South Australia, and in fact the lifeblood of South Australia in some ways. We're talking about the Murray River, and of course it's attached to the Murray-Darling Basin, which has been in the news quite a bit lately with claims of water being removed from the Murray without permission. It's effectively being stolen. Let's have a look at further downstream though at the moment, and the lower lakes, and particularly the Coorong. We've got Fiona Paton, who's with us, and she's an environmental scientist with the Coorong and Lower Lakes Environmental... Oh, yeah, so there's no organisation. You're just the expert.
Thanks, Ian.
Tell us about just how significant those lower lakes and the Coorong particularly are. I mean, we were talking during the break that if you go back... It's in the news at the moment that the new episode of Storm Boy, the new film of Storm Boy, is being filmed down there at the moment as we speak. I hope they weren't filming yesterday in that wind. But it's a good indication of how the Coorong used to look when that film was made originally. It looks a bit different now, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, Alan. And I guess my experience in the Coorong is from monitoring it as part of a team from the University of Adelaide for the past 20 years. And even in those 20 years, we've seen significant changes. But certainly it's a very changed system from even back in the 80s when it was named as a Ramsar wetland of international significance. And it's important on this level. It provides a number of various unique habitats from the freshwater systems of the lower lakes right through to the hypersaline systems of the South Lagoon. And it's really important on an international level because it provides habitat for some shorebirds that migrate from the northern hemisphere here. But in terms of the Murray-Darling Basin, it's also a really important wetland because it's a drought and summer refuge. So when wetlands inland don't have water in summer and in droughts, the Coorong still does, and so it can provide a refuge for these birds. And there are other birds too that use it as a breeding ground. And so it's therefore really important in a lot of different ways.
Has there been a movement in the number of birds that actually migrate there each year over the years?
Yeah, actually, this year was one of the lowest abundances of some shorebirds ever recorded in the Coorong. Particularly prominent species we saw at 1% of their long-term median abundance. So that system is really struggling from a bird perspective, but also from other perspective. An aquatic plant in the Southern Lagoon, which is a really critical food component of the food web, is also lacking resilience in terms of having a very low seed bank. So being an annual plant, having seeds to grow back the following year when water levels increase in spring, it's really important, and it really is lacking that resilience to get through the next drought.
And historically too, the role the Coorong played, if we go further west, further east along the Coorong, the wetlands down around, the lower southeast, the channels and so forth, were put in to drain. We've been playing with it ever since white man arrived, haven't we?
Yeah, significant changes have probably occurred in terms of the Coorong when we also had the barrages built back in the 1930s. So yeah, there are a number of interventions along the way, but also I think primarily it's that reduction in flows in the Murray-Darling Basin in more recent decades that's really started to affect the ecology and health of the Coorong and Murray Mouth region.
And Sandy Pitcher, the boss of the Department of Environment, Water and Natural Resources, that comes back to the point we made earlier, doesn't it, that we have to have this juggling match between making a living out of the Murray and the Darling and looking after the environment. It's a tough one.
We absolutely do, and it is tough, but we're so lucky to have scientists like Fiona and many others who actually help us get the information to make the right decisions and right choices. And I think the thing that we in South Australian government are really saying is we've got this information, we've also got the Goyder Institute and others, and now the responsibility is on all of us to act on that information, and that's probably the overriding message that we as South Australia put into our colleagues across Australia. We know what some of the opportunities are and we know the harm, so we have to make the right choices.
Okay, so how do we react then to the claims made recently that, there is water actually being removed from the system without permission, effectively stolen, and the politics then takes over, instead of drilling down and, pardon the pun, but drilling down and getting to the bottom of the problem, the politics takes over and there are calls for a judicial inquiry. That's not what we've got so far. Where are we at with that? What's your view?
Look, I suppose, all of that, I guess the reason the politics happens is because it is so important, and I'd be a sad citizen of South Australia if people weren't making a noise about it, because when you find out something like that is shocking, you do want people to get off their seats and say, hey, this isn't right. But probably the thing that we need to keep doing is not let just the argy-bargy be the topic. We actually need to go, well, why is it so vital to not have this water taken out of the system? And the reason is, as Fiona says, that the flows are so important, and that flow needs to happen down the river to have all of the multitude of effects that it can have. And it's sometimes not necessarily what's visible to someone's eye standing looking at the river, but actually looking at the effects over time of the way that water's used that is really where we're looking to educate and communicate with people about.
And the authority, is it heading in the right direction? Is it managing the system properly?
Oh, look, I think as we talked about earlier, they've got one of the hardest jobs in Australia in that sense. But the plan is there, and we've all agreed to the plan. And so every time we talk about the plan being delivered on time and in full, and so things like this latest expose that people are taking water, it's in breach of the plan. It is in breach of the laws that we've agreed. And that's the part that I think we need to focus on. And the reason that it's so important is that plan is almost the minimum case that needs to happen. So anything that takes back from that, we know is going to have a hugely detrimental effect. That wasn't the high benchmark. That plan is the absolute minimum we need to achieve a healthy flowing river system. And that's what makes it so vital.
Absolutely. And we'll watch with interest, and let's keep our fingers crossed that, we can cut through the politics and make a positive outcome out of all this. Thanks so much for your time, Sandy Pitcher from the Department of Environment, Water and Natural Resources. Also, Sharon Starick, who is on the South Australian Murray-Darling Basin Natural Resources Management Board. Can I see your business card, please? Both sides must be covered. And also, Fiona Paton. Hey, I've just realised, are you related to another Paton?
I am.
How?
He's my father.
Oh, I wish I had have known that at the beginning of the... I have sat with your father in the Coorong watching birds run across the...
That's not surprising. I think many people have sat in the Coorong watching birds with him.
Lovely to meet you, Fiona.
When you say 20 years of experience, it's a lived experience beyond.
Absolutely. So how much of your childhood did you spend in the Coorong with Dad, sitting in the sand?
Yeah, a fair bit. I think I was tipped into the mud when I was still being carried around on his backpack. So
absolutely fabulous. Well, listen, Dad's in Tassie now, isn't he?
No, it's in Adelaide.
He's still here.
Yep.
Give him our regards. One of the biggest experts on the Coorong, and obviously you're following in his footsteps, so take care. Look after it for us.
Thanks,
okay, we'll go to the news and get the latest on what's happening around the world.